Hi, everyone. Want to welcome you back to the Beyond Immigration Law podcast. This is a podcast that dives deep into the heart of the immigrant experience. We're exploring challenges and triumphs that go beyond the legal battles. With each episode, I like to bring to light the real stories that are really shaping our immigrant communities, from cultural assimilation to the pursuit of the American dream. We're not going to just talk about laws. We're going to talk about what's affecting our immigrant communities, what's making the headlines, get some firsthand reactions, and really think about what are we doing with immigration? What can we do with immigration? And it's not just about where we come from, but where we're going to journey forward together. This podcast is going to be available in video on YouTube, Spotify, as well as audio only form. Be sure to follow us on WR Immigration on LinkedIn or subscribe to our newsletter for more information. So I'm Sharina Garcia, Strategy and Innovation Partner at WR Immigration. I have almost 30 years of experience doing immigration law. I'm a second generation American, roots in the Philippines. My father's journey to the US was deeply influenced by his electrical engineering academia and then led him to the US, and also has inspired me to become an immigration lawyer. So when I share my insights here on our podcast, we talk about different topics. And today we're going to talk about preparing for the new administration. And I know it's a kind of a hot topic right now. And I just want to kind of bring you guys back to my career and what I saw as I started my career almost 30 years ago. So when I look back on my career, 5 presidents: Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, Barack Obama, Donald Trump, and now Joe Biden. And when I first decided to go to law school in 1994 and started my immigration law career in 95, the president was Bill Clinton. Now, during that time, we used IBM wheel-writer typewriters to prepare forms. We did faxes to communicate with the government, and the internet in the workplace was still emerging, right? And we were all very scared about Y2K, right? Because 2000 was coming. And I remember at the time when I was a younger associate, the most impactful change that I had to really understand was the 3 and 10-year bars to reentry. And I remember a time when the H-1B cap was never reached, when the H-1B cap was temporarily raised to meet the demands of the economy. And then when I look back at my career, I find the most challenging time was during President Trump's administration. And as we prepare for the new administration, I really want to explore, like, what is the future immigration policy in the US and what can we expect from each presidential candidate should they take office. So I'm here with the wonderful Monica and Kristie, 2 top-notch political and advocacy strategists who are here shaping immigration policy. I'm really looking forward to learning from them today. And I bet those listening will find some clarity in the really complex political landscape of our immigration policy. So let's go ahead and jump right into it. So Monica, why don't you kick us off and give us a brief introduction of yourself and your experience and what led you to your position today?
Yeah, thank you so much, Trina. I'm so excited to be here. It's so fascinating to hear your experiences because I had a similar journey. I've been doing immigration since a little bit before law school, since 2001, right around. And I was really motivated by September 11th and how I saw immigration laws be used at that time to supplement criminal law. And my background is my father was actually a refugee from Uganda who was resettled in New Orleans in 1972. And so refugees, displacement, immigration stories has always been part of who I am. And it really wasn't until 9/11 that I really realized, like, oh my gosh, this is the power of immigration law. And I got sucked in. And so I have a similar story of sometimes like looking at the practice of immigration law right now and thinking about how different it was back then. I don't even think we had cell phone or smartphones at that time, right? So things are really different. My journey has been just wild, I will say. I never expected to be here doing this work. And so I think I almost sometimes want to say it was a straight shot, but it really wasn't. It was very meandering. And along the way, I have constantly discovered what I'm good at. And I feel like, to be candid, I'm still figuring that out. Like, I feel like, oh, wow, I'm actually really good at this. And so I started off practicing in small firms. Then I actually moved to detention centers. So I was a detention lawyer under George W. Bush, working at the time. I worked for Pro Bar. I was like the only adult detention attorney for like 4,500 detainees, right? Way before there was like a massive detention attorneys. And I, from that moment, really decided I actually wanted to be a law professor. So then I went on a legal academia, and I had this idea that I was going to train like an army of immigration lawyers, and that was what I wanted to do. And so I did do that. I taught immigration law. I worked in law schools. And then I had a baby and realized that childcare was really expensive. So I took some time off, and randomly I got a text from a friend who said, House Judiciary is hiring an immigration counsel. Are you interested? And the words out of my mouth that I will sanitize for this podcast was, hell no, I don't want to work for Congress. That's a much more sanitized version of what I said out loud, literally. And then I met everybody at House Judiciary, and I was like, oh my God, they're immigration nerds, like just like I am. They're academics, and they were policy ones, and they were like, and it was just such a natural fit. And then when I worked on the Hill, I realized, well, actually, I'm not just an academic. I'm actually really good at policy and strategy. And it was sort of just a natural pairing, right? It's something that I think you can always teach, like how to figure out the workings of Congress and the White House. And I had a lot of success. And I was there during the end of the Obama administration, the beginning of the Trump administration. And the reason why I left was family separation. I wrote the family separation bill, and my mom was going through some health issues, balancing kids, and it was really just like, this was a lot. Kind of to your point, like I'd been doing immigration for a really long time, was in the detention centers, and it was just, this was a lot. And so I took some time off, and then I've been working since then on the outside, helping companies and organizations and helping people think through big picture strategy. And one of the things that I think is really useful about my experience is because it hasn't been straight and narrow, because it hasn't been a little bit windy, I often find that when I'm talking about policy and strategy, it's like, well, I actually know how the courts work, right? I actually know how USCIS works, but I actually also know how Congress works. And I actually know how the administrative agencies work. And sort of these multiple experiences have really, for me, lended me to an experience that's very, very well-rounded. But it is interesting when people come to me, like, as a mentee or advice, and how did you get to where you are? And sometimes I just have to hold my hands up and say, I don't know, really. I just sort of follow opportunities that come my way and see what's interesting, and see, most importantly, I would say, where I can work with good people, like where I can work with people who I have alignment with, both morally and substantively, where I feel respected and I can like actually make progress, and then where I can shine. And so like, that's probably the biggest thing that I have taken away now that I'm much older and I have children that I give advice to, right? Which is just like, find the place where you can feel respected, but then also you can do work that you feel like you can make a difference in.
Oh my God. Thank you. Thank you, Monica, for sharing that and sharing your journey. How about you, Kristie?
There's so many things that the three of us have in common. It's kind of funny. Whenever anybody asks me the same question, Monica, I always say, sometimes it's not necessarily about finding what it is that you want to do, but also finding a whole bunch of things that you don't want to do. And I feel like that is a really good overview of some of my trajectory, which is, like I said, kind of similar. So as I was thinking about going to law school, a lot of the cases post 9/11 were starting to be heard in front of courts. We were starting to get some of the initial decisions on those cases. And I kept thinking to myself, it is really wild that there isn't more that's being written about this new intersection between national security law and immigration law. And I am not too far removed from immigration as a person. My grandfather was a first generation American. His dad made shoes in Mexico, and my grandfather went on to become the first Hispanic judge in Nueces County in South Texas. So just another immigrant success story that we all know so many of at this point. But it was kind of, through those stories, just through some general interest. And then, of course, this interest in the intersection between national security law and immigration that kind of guided me into law school and then into getting a master's in national security law and foreign policy. And I really wanted to take that and transition it into better policy work, because as I was coming out and I was intersecting with a lot of kind of public and nonprofit sectors in a bunch of different roles that I did post-graduation from law school. And while I was in DC, I realized that there just wasn't enough depth of experience in these, fields that were now inextricably intertwined. And there was just a lot of fear around it. And I think there was this moment where we saw some of that fear dissipate. But I think that we are seeing a marked resurgence of a lot of that fear today. And it's, I think, one of the reasons that, I still think that this work is so important. So, I too went to law school. I have done a lot of pro bono work in many fields of immigration law since then. But I am currently and have been at the Niskanen Center as their director of immigration for just over 7 years. And I now are senior vice president of policy, and I oversee lots of policies, climate, social policy, criminal justice, and our burgeoning democracy and governance work, which has become, as you both know, increasingly important in the last few years. So excited to be here and delighted to join both of you.
Thank you so much, Kristie, for sharing. And, it's really interesting because, as I was preparing for this podcast, I learned so many things I didn't know, even after being, an attorney for 30 years or almost 30 years. And I think, even when we talk about our immigration and political landscape, it's really interesting to see how everything intersects, but sometimes we don't really understand how that impacts the policies and how everything, well, actually how it boils down to how are we treating immigrants? What are the laws we're enforcing? And so I wanted to ask you both, as we're looking at everything that's going on in our landscape, what do you think could unfold in the White House, Congress, and the courts? And I think it's also important if you guys could just kind of give a background, or especially you, Monica, because you saw all the intersections. If you could kind of explain how that all works.
What I would love for people to understand, because it's a very exciting time right now, Trina. Like, we've had a really tumultuous summer, right? Which we had a potential assassination attempt. We had a leading party candidate step down. We saw him endorsed as vice president, right? So, I think the impact of the political chaos of this summer, I think, can't be overstated. And so I think in this moment, while everyone's focused on the race to the White House in particular, because that's what's getting the most attention, I think the biggest nugget that I would love people who are interested in immigration policy to take away from is that, yes, the White House is important. It's very critically important. However, Congress is just as much, if not, it's just as important. So who has control of either the House or the Senate is going to really dictate the future of immigration. And I think we can all agree that the United States desperately needs immigration reform. We desperately need our laws to be more responsive to our economy and to the technology. Trina, just like you were saying, all of the ways in which your immigration practice started, right, with the typing and the faxing, immigration laws have been relatively the same since then, even as technology has increased so significantly. And so while, yes, I think a lot of folks are focused on the White House, and obviously, yes, it's critically important, it's just as important that we think about Congress, because we need real substantive immigration reform. And I think we're really at a situation where it's like, now more than ever, we have to have real change. And so that's what I think is getting a little bit lost in this noise of all of the conventions and the sort of political tumultuousness that we're in.
Well, yeah. And then Kristie, with all the, we're working on the parole in place, right? And when we're talking to clients, it comes out with well, what's going to happen to this law and how are the courts going to react to this? So maybe you could speak to that as well, on top of what Monica said.
I think Monica's exactly right. And, I think that we have done such an incredible job convincing the American people and Congress that our immigration system is broken. But now we sort of have to go a step beyond that and actually demonstrate how it is fixable. And I think we often fall into the trap of thinking that the executive branch has so much power. And they do have a lot of power. And we see that in programs like PIP. The reminder, though, of course, is to Monica's point, you know, Congress is in charge of funding everything that we
Yes.
do or we don't do.
Yes.
And it is not always the most exciting discussion to talk about appropriations,
Yeah.
but we have seen how even in a White House led by President Biden, where we really thought there were going to be substantially more opportunities to do some of the things that we've been thinking about for the better part of 40 years now, they were stymied by a Congress that was sort of unwilling to move on all of these things. So as much as all the policy wonks and the immigration lawyers want to just say, we know what the problems are, we know what the fixes are, if only Congress would do this, it is a stark reminder of really how important the politics is of this moment and how difficult it is to divorce those politics from the policy. And I think, when you throw in the courts, it becomes exponentially more complicated. And we saw that, of course, under the Trump administration. We've seen it under the Biden administration to a lesser extent. But now with the Chevron ruling and its impact on even BIA decisions, which, decides on so many important, issues like who belongs to a particular social group, what is a crime involving moral turpitude, what is the definition of a child status protection in hardship cases. I mean, there is so much that is going to be revisited as a result of that decision, and then will also be relitigated, that suddenly the power of the executive, which we know is big, we know is extensive, especially with some of the previous Supreme Court rulings that we have seen, we also know that it is going to be exponentially limited because of this decision. And exactly how that shakes out is kind of a wash. I can make a strong argument that it's going to benefit a potential Trump administration, for instance. I can also make an argument that it's going to significantly benefit a Harris administration. So it kind of remains to be seen. But thankfully, there's a lot of really smart lawyers who are thinking about it and preparing those cases.
Well, I think, as we're talking to, and getting ready for the PIP and trying to explain to our clients, because, we have like this informed consent that we're having them sign to help them understand that, yes, we're going to submit the application. And then people are racing to submit their application before, there's an injunction or things change, and it's really, it's challenging, I think, for a lot of immigrants because it's the hope and then the hope is gone. Right. And then it's the hope again, and then the hope is gone. Especially for those who've been here, it's supposed to impact, like, I think they said 500,000 people, and keep families together and things like that. And so I guess my question to your point, Kristie, is you talk about budget and all of that. So what is the personnel going to look like in the new administration? And every time there's a new person heading, Department of Homeland Security, what can we expect,
Yeah, I mean, I think the easy answer is that it's going to be drastically different, depending on what administration we see. I think that there will be a lot of similarities between a Harris administration and a Biden administration. We haven't seen a lot of specifics come out of the Harris campaign yet about how they might diverge potentially from a Biden administration. But we have heard her talk a lot about both kind of a tough on border approach with an earned pathway to citizenship, but we haven't seen a lot of details beyond that yet. I think the bigger and more worrisome question, of course, is what will happen under a Trump administration. And I think although candidate Trump and his running mate, J.D. Vance, have tried desperately to distance themselves from Project 2025, Project 2025 is a beautiful blueprint of what that administration plans to do, which is essentially gut a lot of the big agencies that make these decisions, and also at the same time really expand the bureaucratic hurdles of what it's going to be able to take to process, not only humanitarian relief seekers, but absolutely legal immigration. And if there was any question about whether or not they are going to use Project 2025, you only have to look at the first administration, when they implemented about 65% of the Heritage Foundation's recommendations within just the first year of the Trump administration.
Yeah. And Monica, you were there, part of the personnel. So tell us really, what is it like,
Yeah, it's kind of wild because I will say that a lot of the Republicans that were on the opposite side of me on the House Judiciary and Senate Judiciary actually ended up in the Trump administration. So these are people that I worked, closely with and know quite well. And so when Trump was elected, all of the policies and the rhetoric were things that I had been battling as an attorney on the House Judiciary Committee because the same people went into the Trump administration. And so while the rest of the country was shocked, for me, it was like, it was just more of the same of what I was battling on a day to day. Not that that made me feel any better, but it was at least that I felt like I was slightly prepared. I will say that I do want to give a little bit of sort of added color to the Project 2025 issue, which is that, yes, I do think it's true that Project 2025 will be followed if Trump is elected. However, I think it's also likely that the most extreme policies have not been published. And so I actually think that Project 2025 are the policies that they're putting out there, and they're holding on to their best and brightest ideas that they're actually not going to put in writing or not going to put publicly. One of the things that I'm most worried about in the Trump administration is two things. Policies will be more clandestine. Memos will be classified so that the public can't access them, litigators can't access them. And so I worry about a increased level of secrecy. So Project 2025 is very open, right? This is what we want to do the first year, kind of to Kristie's point. However, what happens the second, third, and fourth year? And I worry that what they're actually going to do is insulate agencies. And the second thing I'm really worried about is that they're going to expel career agency experts. And we saw this under the Trump administration, where a lot of really, deep experts who work in these agencies, who know how the agencies work, who know the ins and outs, left. Nobody was, fired in the way that Trump is proposing for the next administration, but a lot of people left. And so if you have both a purging of agency experts, as well as a additional layer of security or classified nature to memos and policies and documents. For example, in one of the videos for Project 2025, they're encouraging people not to put anything in writing, right? To go down to the cafe and talk to each other over a cup of coffee, right? They're not going to make the same mistakes that they made the first administration, first term, which is that they had tons of lawsuits, right? They're going to do whatever they can to subvert the law. And I think they're going to play dirty. And meaning by playing dirty, I mean not be transparent about what the policies are. That part, what I worry about is that the worst is actually yet to come. And that's hard because Project 2025 is already so bad that it's a little frightening to think, okay, actually, what are they really going to do?
Well, something as simple as, I do a podcast with Charlie Oppenheim about the Visa Bulletin, and just kind of talking to him. And I would just ask him, like, why did it take so long for you to publish the Visa Bulletin? And he would tell me, well, because there were added layers of review that were put in that actually made a process that was relatively seamless actually more difficult, right? And I think that's to your point, right, Monica? Kristie, any other things you want to comment on?
Oh, there's so many rabbit holes that we could go down on Project 2025. I will flag that Niskanen published a deep dive on the immigration pieces in February of this year. So if anybody wants to go down some of those rabbit holes, I'll point you to that resource.
Great. So now let's talk about what are the immigration policies under the different leadership, so under each candidate. And what changes can we expect in immigration if Harris wins, or what if Trump wins, right? And let's talk about first with entry into the U.S. What are we going to see for candidate Harris and what are we going to see for candidate Trump? So who wants to take that one?
I can start.
Okay.
And I think, under Harris, kind of just echoing what Kristie said, I think that we're largely going to see the same policies largely on the executive branch as it relates to entry. what we need is we need more entries, right? We need more visas, we need more pathways. So then again, just sort of point back to the comment that I made earlier, which is that we need more visas, we need Congress to do that, right? Kind of what you were saying about what Charlie Oppenheim said about the visa bulletin under Trump, I think what will happen is you're going to see more fraud screenings, more security checks, everything's slowing down. I do think that there's going to be increased scrutiny for certain groups of people. And here I want to flag immigrants and non-immigrants from China, from the Middle East, from people of Muslim backgrounds. And I do think it will be very security first. The one thing that I think that is important to understand a Trump mindset of the people who work in the Trump administration is that they're assuming that every application is fraudulent.
Yes.
And it is, you have to prove that it's not fraudulent. So they, instead of innocent before proving guilty is, the way the criminal legal system goes. Under the Trump administration, it's guilty before proven innocent, right? They're going to assume that every application that comes across their desk is fraudulent. And I know this from working intimately with a lot of the folks who worked in the Trump administration. They believe that every application is fraudulent. So they believe that, for example, when they look at high approval rates, they believe that the high approval rates are a reflection of a system that is fraudulent, that's not working well. They believe that low approval rates means that they're doing a better job because they're doing a better job of catching fraud. So how that translates to entry is that everything gets slowed from the State Department, from interviews. One of the things is that the Biden administration has done away with a lot of requiring people to come in for interviews, right? And that's going to go away. They've done video interviews. They've done remote interviews, right? All of this stuff to streamline, all that stuff is going to go away. They're going to require people to come in, and we all know what those wait times were like, right? All around the world, because they're assuming that every immigrant before them, non-immigrant before them, is fraudulent or a security threat. And when you're approaching immigration from that perspective, that every person in front of you is an undesirable or a criminal or a fraud, that adds unneeded levels of scrutiny.
Well, just to go to that, so what I saw, I had to go to the interviews, right? And there were different kinds of officers. So for those, some officers, they just wanted to get it off, they had to, do the interviews. And then I would sit there with one officer where she would read 88 questions of inadmissibility and ask, all these questions. And it was very painful, to sit there because the answer was always no. But it's to your point, Monica, that's what we really saw during that time period. How about you, Kristie?
It's this kind of strange mixture of, shrinking bureaucracy and growing bureaucracy at the same time. And, we see that when in Project 2025, we see the plans to just basically stop processing and stop letting staff work on any applications or renewals for DACA, for Uniting for Ukraine, for refugees. They're going to end TPS. I mean, those are all things I think that are anticipated as far as arrivals. But, then there's these kind of smaller things that get to the point that Monica is just making, like adding this requirement that the Fraud Detection and National Security Directorate review every application and petition and request. Right now, on average, they review about 35,000 cases a year.
Yeah.
USCIS reviews close to 9 million. I mean, that in and of itself is going to stymie things to the point where, even somebody that can answer every single question clearly, where there is absolutely no indication of fraud, they've been, a legal, law-abiding visa holder for a long time, is going to be completely stymied through the process. And I think our frustration levels as advocates and lawyers is going to go through the roof. And that's to say nothing, of course, for the immigrants that are looking for entry into the U.S. So I think it is part of that. But of course, even beyond entry, it's going to be difficult for the people that are here to stay here. Or even to want to stay here. We're going to do, I think, under a Trump administration, everything in our power to sort of push the folks that we even want to be in the United States out of the United States, which is really unfortunate. Beyond, a little bit what Monica was saying about a Harris administration, which I think is right, is that I am very interested to see where they might take some of the more innovative programs that President Biden stood up.
Yeah.
Welcome Corps is really starting to move On the precipice are, these Welcome Corps programs at colleges and universities, Welcome Corps at work for labor pathways. And then certainly there is a lot of promise in expanding the safe mobility offices, both physical and virtual in Central and South America and beyond. And we see throughout the rest of the world that there are a lot of other countries who are really interested in looking to capitalize on all of the people that want to move now. And I think it's an important reframing that the Harris administration has done nicely, and the Biden administration, which is that, this isn't the movement of people is not the burden that Donald Trump wants you to believe that it is, but is really something that is going to benefit the countries that understand how to capitalize on that first.
I just wanted to piggyback on that, which is just to say that, there have been so many economic studies that have shown that the influx of migration is actually what has staved off inflation and helped the economy. And we all know, right, as immigration lawyers, right, that immigration is good for the economy. We all know this anecdotally. We can talk about all the major tech companies that were started by immigrant founders. However, the recent data shows that the recent influx of migrants has actually helped our U.S. economy more so than relative to other countries. And I think one of the things that, as Kristie was talking, is that I was thinking about is we also need to think about what are the long-term negative impacts that all of these policies could have on the economy. And all of the studies have shown that we need workers, we need labor, we need them up and down, right? We need high skilled workers and we need, all kinds of workers in order to have a healthy, robust economy. We have baby boomers that are aging out. And so the other thing about Trump is that not only are these policies, in my opinion, xenophobic, they're also just not smart economic policies. We are not going to be a competitor. We're not going to have not just the best and brightest, although it's important. We need semiconductors, we need AI people, but we need people to boost up our economy on all fronts. And I really, one thing that, I'm really worried about is that in November, if Trump has secured enough electoral college votes, I do think you're going to see companies making different decisions. I think you're going to see companies moving to Canada. I think you're going to see companies moving to Mexico. I think people are going to be, I don't think that a lot of companies are going to be, some might be willing to put up with a little bit of it, but not, I think you're going to see a lot of companies are going to be making different decisions. And then what is that long-term impact for all of us?
Well, I mean, that brings me to my second point, because I deal in the business immigration, corporate immigration world. And, how is that going to impact green card sponsorship, visa issuances? What can companies actually expect? And they're starting to ask us, Sharina, what changes do you think will happen? Because they need to plan as well, too, right? Because what are we going to do with our workforce? Because even now, as it stands, regardless of which candidate wins, for an Indian to be sponsored for a green card, it's going to take them about 14 years for them to get a green card. And now they're moving towards EB-5 because it's faster and, cashing out on their stock options and doing things like that. So what can you tell us about that and how it's going to impact, corporate immigration policies or how corporations really structure their immigration programs?
Very negatively, I think.
Yeah.
It's sort of hard to ascertain what the difference is going to be. I think that there's going to be an enormous difference. Even if we don't talk about refugees or asylees or parolees or TPS or any of those programs, if we just focus on legal visas, we are going to see, I think, a precipitous drop in the number of legal visas that are issued every year. And it's for any and all of these reasons, but all sort of marching towards the same goal of really reducing the overall level of immigration to the United States. And I think, Monica made a point earlier that is sort of the guiding light of this administration is that they learned last time and are significantly better prepared, in my opinion, to effectuate these changes without, getting the courts involved. And, I think a lot of these changes are sort of brilliantly designed to be quite nicely effectuated. And even if they are challenged, which I assume that they will be, they are going to come out on top. So this all kind of comes full circle to this moment where we really need Congress, which is going to have razor thin margins, regardless of who wins the White House, to kind of step up here, because there are a lot of Republicans who live in districts where immigration is incredibly important.
Yeah.
And when they start to see sort of the downstream effects of, not just cutting off humanitarian visas, which I feel like a lot of people are more likely to sort of cut off, but, when they stop seeing H-2 workers coming in, when their businesses stop seeing some of their H-1Bs come in, when their schools aren't getting the full tuition paying foreign students to come to our universities, they are going to start hearing about it, and they are going to suffer the consequences. And it's going to be, those constituents, both Americans and immigrants alike, who are suffering the economic impacts of those decisions. So these businesses, I think, and corporations should be calling those Republicans and starting to talk to them about where they intend to stand up and protect some of these really important programs, even if it's not the full spectrum of what we would like to see.
Yeah. Monica, anything else you want to share?
Yeah, so a couple of things I'll say. I mean, one, I think Kristie mentioned this earlier, which is that if there are areas that have a significant backlog, Trump administration, or at least Project 2025, has said that they will stop processing in categories that have significant backlogs. So what does that mean practically? For example, the Indian National that you mentioned previously. The other thing that I mentioned previously that I want to highlight again is I do think that the Trump administration might have different policies for different immigrants based on their country of origin or country of birth. And I think that is a really important thing to think about. And again, the country that I'm most worried about is China. The Trump administration, and I would say a little bit of the Biden administration as well, has really gone after Chinese students, Chinese scholars. There's a bipartisan push towards increasing scrutiny of Chinese immigrants and non-immigrants. And without casting judgment on the validity of that, I do want to say that anytime you do have a national security issue, I think the Trump administration is going to use that as an excuse to pause immigration from certain places. One of the things that I'm really worried about that I've seen Republicans do in the past or support is they will allege that a specific program is just rife with fraud, or specific immigration from a specific region is rife with fraud. And the solution to that is they'll propose pausing so that they can review. So let's play that out. So let's say they say, you know what, we're going to pause all immigration from China because we have these 5 cases that are fraudulent. Now, what does that mean for the corporations who have applications in the pipeline, whether they be immigrant or non-immigrant visas, if they pause immigration from an entire country? Now, of course, there'll be litigation of those who go through the courts. It's hard, though, if the justification is security. Yes. And if that information is classified. Just going back to my point previously, I think that I am worried that it'll be nation and ethnic origin based additional scrutiny. And I think the best and the brightest and the most talented immigrants are, quite frankly, not going to want to put up with that after a while, because they're coming to a country to devote their talents. And if they're being treated like criminals, I think you're going to find that in this global economy, there are other places where they can work. And you're going to see Ireland is a great example, right? Yeah. They're welcoming immigrants with open arms, right? Everyone talks about Canada, but Ireland's a really good example of a country that's taking a different approach. And so I don't think it'll be a uniform strategy other than a uniform slowing down strategy. And within that, I think there will be variations based on the national and ethnic origin.
Well, during that time with my clients, it became, clients always want to plan, companies want to plan, and it became a very reactive environment where something would be published and then we're like, okay, how does this impact us now? How are we going to bring our people in? We had already planned to do this. We already have this office space that we've already, decided to bring in 100 foreign workers to help us build our solar or whatever, X, Y, and Z, right? Engineers. And I think that that's really important. And I guess, Monica and Kristie, what can these companies do to talk to Congress or do things like that? And I think that's really important for them to understand too, because if you just kind of sit there and wait, that's going to happen, right? It's like the things you don't want to happen will actually happen to your workforce. So what are your
Yeah.
recommendations on what they can do to actually affect some change?
I mean, I think there's a huge role for business and corporations to play in this. We saw pieces of it, I think, during the last administration. I think initially, they tried to work a lot with the Trump administration, and then some of those opportunities were sort of closed. But we have seen corporations and businesses really come together on issues like DACA and protecting dreamers. There will certainly be, I think, an opportunity for that kind of coalition building again. But there's also an enormous opportunity for them to make a much bigger and more powerful statement about the need for workers without fear of backlash, especially in this economy that immigrants are taking Americans' jobs, which in my opinion has been one of the biggest holdups, I think, for a lot of the corporate and business leaders across America. But there is, so much, just copious amounts of evidence that is in fact not the case, that we need a lot more, that this isn't, a pie, and that everybody can have their slice here.
Yeah.
America is so much more than a finite pie of benefits. And if they're willing to sort of step up, I think that they can have a really powerful voice that is pretty equivalent to, what we might hear from Congress and certainly grassroots and grass tops advocates and others in the space.
Monica?
Yeah, I 100% agree with Kristie. I firmly believe that corporate entities have a lot of power to influence immigration policy, neither a Harris or Trump administration. And I would go farther to say that I actually think it's an underutilized power. They have been active with DACA. Under the Trump administration, what I observed is that first, they were overly optimistic that Trump, being a business person, would have understood their interests. So I think there was a little bit of optimism there. And then for the second half of his first term, I saw them be a little bit worried about Trump's reactiveness and what that would mean for their business. And I think it's important to understand that corporate entities have many issues that they lobby Congress on. And immigration is just one of many issues that they lobby. And I believe it hasn't been as forefront amongst the other issues they lobby on. And my message, if I were going to speak to a corporate entity at the moment, was to say to have immigration be like at least a one or two, right? Because if you don't have a workforce, you don't have a company. And I know taxes are really important. And I know, like, for example, there's so much that you have to lobby, right, Congress on. But if you don't have workers, you don't have a company. And I would love to see, regardless of who wins, corporations really stepping up to be a voice of reason when it comes to labor and the economy and workforce. You see a little bit of this through different associations and entities that they're a part of. However, I would love to see more one-to-one communications. I can tell you that as a congressional staffer, I was definitely in the room when corporations would come to talk to us about immigration. But to Kristie's point, I don't know that they were having the same conversations with us as a Democrat that they were having with Republicans.
Yeah.
And I, would really ask that for the sake of our country, please go and tell your story and the story of your workers, because there's so much on the line for all of us as Americans if we have a really restricted immigration policy.
Yeah. And I think that's usually where people are always asking us as, advocates, how can we advocate, for our employees? And I think it's really important that we get that out there, because there is a large amount of concern, right, about what could happen, in the next. So in the minutes that we have, just briefly, future of immigration reform. What your thoughts? You're like, oh my God, Trina, that's like so big.
So I can start because I have a thought that I've been sort of mulling in my head since we've been talking, which is that I really believe, and this is going to sound like a very dramatic statement, I really believe that this is the most consequential election for immigration policy in my lifetime. And I say that because I believe that if Trump is elected, I think immigration policy is going to erode and degrade to an extent that we've never seen before. And I think if Harris wins, we have the opportunity, at least for status quo, if not immigration reform at the congressional level. And I would say, and I want to make this clear because I realize I didn't say this, which is that I believe that immigration reform only happens if Democrats control both the House and the Senate, because Republicans have shown a reluctance to be forward leaning on immigration. Not all Republicans, but the party as a whole. So I believe this is the most, I'm optimistic and scared, but I do believe it's the most consequential election in my lifetime.
Kristie?
I don't disagree with any of that, but it is nice that we differ very slightly since we've agreed on nearly everything. I do think that there are a cadre of Republicans who do want to fix this issue and no longer see it as a valuable political football, which it has been for both parties for many, many years. I think that they are tiring of some of this and are tiring of the kind of populist nativist messaging that is working for some members of the Republican Party. I do think even with a narrow split or, a Republican majority in the Senate, there is still hope for some kind of reform. And I say that because I think that we are on the precipice of a lot of pretty terrible things that are going to impact all Americans, regardless of whether you're a Republican or a Democrat. One of the things Monica talked about was the cost of childcare.
Yeah.
We see the cost of care across the board, both for our children and for, our elderly parents skyrocketing.
Yeah.
We don't have residential facilities to put them in. We don't have doctors. We don't have nurses. We don't have staff at these places. We are about to tip off of that cliff. That's going to force the hand. We see the same thing in, things like dreamers and teachers and, you can insert many, many policies there. And of course, I'm not an advocate for waiting until things are, urgent, but it is often that motivates Congress to do something. Yeah. And I think that there is hope if we can get one step, if we can get one small thing done, there is a chance that Congress will do a next small thing. Yeah. And that is the role that I am hoping that we will take. That said, I think, not only did the Trump administration learn a lot from the last time, but I think everybody has learned a lot from last time. There's significantly more coordination. I think everybody is definitely more ready for a second administration, even if, to Monica's point, I do think it will be absolutely devastating for immigrants and Americans alike, though immigrants certainly more so. But if we were to look for a silver lining, there will be a moment where we rebuild and people will see that this isn't a message that reflects what Americans want or that we need. So hopefully that will offer a high point.
Yeah. Well, thank you to you both. And, this has really been a wonderful discussion. And if our listeners want to find you, where can they find you, Kristie?
You can email me from our website at niskanencenter.org, or you can follow me on Twitter. I think both links are there.
Okay. And Monica?
And you can follow me. I don't tweet a lot, but you can go to my website, Sankey Strategies, and reach out to me there.
Well, I want to thank you both for having this podcast with me and this really great discussion. Be sure to follow us on LinkedIn and stay tuned for our next Beyond Immigration Law podcast. Thank you.
Thank you both.